Picture this. France, January 1544. The royal apartments are warm with tapestries and candlelight, thick with the breath of courtiers waiting for certainty. When the Dauphin is finally brought forth, bells ring and prayers rise. But the celebration is restrained, almost cautious. The child is small, too small. His cries are thin, reedy, lacking the force expected from a future king of France. Nurses exchange glances. They do not dare explain from his first breath. Francis of Valois carries not triumph, but fragility. He is the first surviving son of Henry, the second to France and Catherine de' Medici, a union forged to secure dynastic continuity after generations of failed wings' piety. His body, however, does not reflect that confidence. As an infant, he suffers frequent fevers, digestive troubles, and unexplained weakness. Court physicians describe him as delicate, a word that conceals more than it reveals. In private notes, they record recurring inflammations of the throat and his episodes of pain that leave the child screaming inconsolably for hours. The Valois court is no stranger to Sicilia's generation of political marriages. Stress and untreated childhood illnesses have left their mark. Francis grows slowly, his limbs thin, his posture uncertain. He is often confined indoors while healthier children ride and train. Tutors note that he tires quickly, his attention wandering, his face pale and dumb with sweat. Even during mild exertion, his ears frequently inflamed are treated with policies and oils, remedies that soothe nothing and mask infection rather than cure it. Quick reminder before the next chapter, hit that subscribe button for more videos like this and write your city or country in the comments. It helps more than you know. Now let's dive in. By early childhood, the pattern is unmistakable. Francis suffers repeated earaches, accompanied by headaches that radiate across his skull. At night, servants hear him whimpering in pain, pressing his hand to the side of his head. Pierce occasionally seeps from the ear canal. An ominous sign in an age that does not yet understand bacterial infection. The court physicians call it humoral imbalance. They prescribe bloodletting. The pain returns. Catherine de' Medici watches her son with growing dread. She has already buried children. She understands how easily royal bodies fail behind silken ceremony. She orders constant supervision, additional physicians, prayers, and relics brought to the nursery. Francis grows up, surrounded not by play, but by vigilance. His childhood is an extended medical observation disguised as princely education. At 14, he is married to Mary, Queen of Scots, herself a child raised among political expectations. The union is meant to cement alliances and produce heirs. Instead, it places two adolescents into a marriage. Neither is prepared to understand Francis. Small and physically underdeveloped, shows little interest or capacity for intimacy. His chronic ailments persist, flaring unpredictably. The ear infections worsen under stress, traveling deeper, becoming more frequent and more painful. When Henry II dies suddenly in 1559, Francis thrust into uncertainty. Francis ascends the throne at just 15 years old. The crown is placed upon a body already strained, inflamed, and exhausted. He is king in title, but from the beginning he struggles even with the rituals of rule. Public appearances leave him drained. Long ceremonies trigger headaches so severe he must retreat to darkened rooms, pressing cloths against his ear while courtiers wait in silence. The infection is no longer intermittent. It has become chronic. Contemporary descriptions mention a foul odor, a discharge that stains linens, the swelling behind the ear that grows tender and hot to the touch. Today, it would be recognized as masterivitis, a dangerous extension of middle ear infection into the bone of the skull. In the 16th century, it is treated with prayers, compresses, and denial. No incision is made, no drainage is attempted. The disease is allowed to linger, sealed inside the king's head, and slowly its consequences begin to surface. Francis, his speech begins to change. His voice weakens, sometimes slurring after bouts of pain. He grows irritable, confused, prone to sudden mood swings. At council meetings, he loses track of discussions, staring blankly as his uncles of the House of Guise maneuver power around him. Ministers whisper that the king is gentle, a polite euphemism for incapable. Behind closed doors, doctors worry that the infection may be spreading inward. Mary watches her husband deteriorate with a mixture of fear and isolation. She is a queen consort, trapped in a foreign court, married to a boy whose body seems to be betraying him daily. The marriage remains unconsummated. Not from lack of opportunity, but from Francis's persistent illness and immaturity. The Valois succession, already precarious, begins to tremble. By late 1559, Francis is rarely without pain. Fever accompanies the infection, sometimes spiking so high that he hallucinates. He complains of ringing noises, dizziness, and nausea. He vomits after meals. His balance falters. Servants support him as he walks, his hand instinctively rising to the side of his head, fingers pressing as if he could hold his skull together through force of will. Court physicians debate. Some argue the infection must be drained of. Others fear intervention near the head, believing it could kill him instantly. In the end, they do nothing decisive. They bleed him. They purge him. They pray. Meanwhile, the infection burrows deeper, eroding bone, inching closer to the brain. France, outwardly stable, is already slipping toward religious conflict. Inside the palace, the true crisis is biological. The king's body is failing faster than politics can adapt each day. Francis grows weaker, thinner, more withdrawn. His crown weighs heavier on a neck already bowed by pain. This is not yet death, but it is the beginning of the end. Francis, the second to France, has inherited not just a throne, but a body ill-equipped to carry out what festers in his ear will soon consume his reign, turning a localized infection into a dynastic catastrophe. The empire does not yet know it, but the collapse has already begun, quietly, invisibly inside the skull of its king. By the winter of 1559, the illness was no longer confined to the shadows of Francis's private chambers. It followed him into council rooms, chapels, and public ceremonies. The silent presence that undermined every gesture of authority. The young king sat on his throne, pale and rigid, his jaw clenched. One hand often raised unconsciously toward his ear, as if bracing against an internal assault no one else could feel. Courtiers mistook the movement for nervous habit. Physicians knew better. The infection had progressed beyond the middle ear. Swelling behind the mastoid bone became visible. A hard, painful knot beneath the skin. Francis complained of pressure inside his head, describing it as if something were pushing outward from behind his eyes. His fevers came in, waves leaving him drenched and trembling. At times, he struggled to focus his vision, blinking rapidly as the room tilted around him. These were no longer childhood ailments. There were signs of invasion. Politically, France was fracturing. The house of G.I.'s uncles to Marie Stuart tightened its grip on the machinery of state, sidelining Catherine de' Medici and ruling in the king's name. Francis, barely 16, lacks the strength and clarity to resist during council sessions. His responses were delayed, sometimes nonsensical. He repeated phrases spoken moments earlier, nodded without comprehension, and occasionally lapsed into silence. So prolonged that ministers continued debating as if he were not present. The pain worsened at night. Servants reported that Francis screamed suddenly in his sleep, clutching his head disoriented and drenched in sweat. Thick discharge continued to seep from his ear, staining pillow linens with a yellowish fluid that carried a sharp putrid odor. The physician was changed dressings daily, applying warm compresses and aromatic salves, hoping to draw the corruption outward. Instead, the swelling hardened, suggesting that the infection had reached the bone. In March 1560, the political crisis erupted into violence. The conspiracy of Envoy exposed the fragility of the Valois throne, revealing widespread resentment against forced dominance. Prisoners were dragged through palace corridors, the screams echoing beneath the same ceilings where Francis lay, shivering with fever. Public executions followed, bodies hanging from the castle walls as warnings. The king was present in name, but barely in body. Witnesses described Francis during these days as withdrawn, his face slack, his gaze unfocused. He complained of constant ringing in his ears and sudden waves of dizziness that forced him to sit abruptly or risk collapse on one occasion while being assisted down a corridor. He vomited violently and nearly fainted, his legs buckling beneath him. The physicians blamed exhaustion. The truth was more sinister. The infection was spreading inward. Francis began experiencing episodes of confusion and agitation. Moments when he failed to recognize familiar faces, he grew irritable, snapping at attendants, then dissolving into tears without explanation. His speech slurred intermittently, particularly after nights of intense pain. He complained that sounds felt distant, muffled, as though the world were receding behind a wall of pressure. Catherine de' Medici grew increasingly alarmed. She summoned additional physicians, including surgeons experienced with head wounds. Some whispered of trepidation. the risky opening of the skull to release pressure. Others warned that intervention near the brain could hasten death. No consensus emerged. In the end, nothing decisive was done. Bloodletting was repeated. Leeches were applied behind the ear. Francis weakened further. Mary Stuart remained at his side, watching helplessly as her husband's condition deteriorated. She was still a teenager, isolated in a hostile court, married to a king whose illness rendered him distant and fragile. Their shared chambers became a place of whispered consultations and quiet fear. The marriage remained unfulfilled, not out of choice, but because Francis, his body could barely endure the strain of daily existence. By late spring, the king's headaches became relentless. He described a crushing sensation as if his skull were being tightened from within. Bright light caused him pain. Loud sounds made him flinch. His balance deteriorated further. He walked with assistance, his steps hesitant, and even the swelling behind the ear grew visibly inflamed. The skin stretched and reddened, warm to the touch. At court, rumors spread. Some whispered of poison. Others suggested divine punishment. Few understood that an untreated ear infection, trivial in appearance, could burrow through bone and invade the brain. Francis's physicians documented fevers exceeding what they had seen before, accompanied by delirium. At times he muttered incoherently, grasping at the air, pleading for the pain to stop. Politically, his incapacity became undeniable. Decisions were made without him. Decrees were presented for his approval. When he was lucid enough to hold a pen, when he was not, they waited or proceeded regardless. France was being ruled around a king who was slowly being consumed from within. By early summer, Francis's condition reached a turning point. The infection had likely breached the cranial cavity. He developed stiffness in his neck, a classic sign of meningeal involvement. His fever spiked dangerously high. His consciousness fluctuated. He slept for hours, then awoke disoriented, unaware of where he was or what day it was. The crown remained upon his head, but authority had slipped entirely from his grasp. The veil of Wine dynasty, already weakened by factionalism and religious tension, now faced a more primitive threat. The failure of the king's body. What began as pain in the air had become a silent executioner. This was no sudden tragedy. It was a slow biological siege, and it was far from over. By the late summer of 1560, Francis II was no longer simply ill. He was decomposing while still alive. The infection that had once throbbed quietly behind his ear had crossed a fatal threshold, advancing beyond bone into the delicate structures that govern thought, balance, and consciousness. The king's body had become a battleground. His physicians no longer understood, let alone controlled. The pain was constant now. No position brought relief. Francis sat rigid for hours, his neck stiff, his jaw clenched, his breath shallow and uneven. He could no longer tolerate light. Curtains were drawn tight across the windows of his chambers, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight, broken only by candle flame. Even that glow made him wince. Sounds distorted in his head, echoing painfully, as if every word struck against inflamed tissue. The discharge from his ear thickened and darkened. What had once been yellow seepage became streaked with blood. The odor grew unmistakable, sweet, metallic, and putrid, the smell of tissue dying. Servants recoiled when changing his linens, though they hid their reactions behind disciplined silence. This was not mere sickness, it was rot. Francis's fevers climbed higher than before, sometimes breaking, suddenly leaving him drenched and shivering. During these episodes his mind fractured. He spoke to people who were not present, addressing dead relatives, reciting fragments of prayers, begging unseen figures for mercy. At times he screamed, clutching his head, pleading for someone to open it and release the pressure. The physicians argued constantly. Some insisted the infection must be drained surgically despite the risks. Others feared that any incision near the skull would kill him instantly. In truth, both were likely correct. The infection had advanced too far. Intervention might hasten death, but inaction guaranteed it. Paralysis followed debate. The king bled instead. Herbal compresses were pressed against the swelling until the skin blistered. Francis screamed through clenched teeth, then fell into exhausted silence. Each treatment stripped strength from a body already collapsing. Neurological signs multiplied. His face began to droop subtly on one side, the muscles slack and unresponsive. His speech deteriorated into slurred fragments. Vowels stretched and broken. At times he struggled to swallow. choking on water, coughing weakly as attendants held him upright. The infection had begun to interfere with the nerves controlling his face and throat. Walking became impossible. When lifted from bed, his legs trembled uncontrollably. Vertigo struck without warning, sending waves of nausea through him. On one occasion, he collapsed while being moved, vomiting violently before losing consciousness. When he awoke hours later, he did not recognize his surroundings. He asked where his mother was. Though Catherine stood beside him, Mary Stuart watched the disintegration of her husband with growing horror. The boy she had married was vanishing beneath fever, confusion, and pain. By autumn, the king's condition became unmistakably terminal. He developed rigidity in his neck and back, resisting movement, a sign that the infection had inflamed the membranes surrounding his brain. His consciousness flickered unpredictably. Sometimes he seemed lucid for minutes, speaking softly, apologizing for his weakness. Then his eyes glazed over. His body stiffened and he drifted into delirium once more. The court, desperate to maintain appearances, restricted access to the king. Audiences were cancelled. Decrees issued in his name without his presence. France was now ruled entirely by proxy, while its monarch lay trapped inside a skull filling with pressure and poison. Physicians recorded tremors in Francis's limbs, uncontrolled twitching that persisted even during sleep. His pulse became erratic, sometimes racing, sometimes dangerously slow. His breathing turned shallow, punctuated by long pauses that terrified those watching over him. Every sign pointed to intracranial infection, an abscess expanding within the skull, compressing vital centers one by one. That night, the king sometimes sobbed, clutching the sheets, whispering that something was eating him from the inside. He knew he was dying. He knew the pain was not passing. He begged Catherine to make it stop. She could not. By November 1560, Francis II was scarcely recognizable. His face was drawn and ashen, his eyes sunken, his body wasted by fever and starvation. He had lost the strength to sit upright. His words, when they came at all, were barely audible, saliva pulled at the corner of his mouth. The infection, unchecked, had claimed nearly every system it touched. The King of France lay reduced to a suffering body, his crown irrelevant, his authority dissolved. Bypass pressure and neglect. The Valois dynasty, already trembling, now balanced on the edge of extinction, undone not by rebellion or blade, but by infection festering in the darkness of a royal skull. The decline of Francis II had entered its final and most brutal phase. The infection that had consumed his air and burrowed into the bones of his skull was no longer localized. It had become systemic, poisoning his blood, compressing his brain and dismantling the fragile coordination that still allowed him to speak, swallow and remain conscious for brief intervals. The king's chambers had transformed into a sick room, sealed from daylight and truth alike. His body no longer obeyed predictable rhythms. Fever burned relentlessly, interrupted by violent chills that left him shaking them controllable. Beneath heavy blanket, his skin alternated between clammy heat and a corpse-like cold. Attendants recorded episodes where his pulse became faint and irregular, his breathing shallow, his lips tinged with blue. Each crisis appeared fatal. Yet he lingered on, suspended in a state between awareness and collapse. The neurological damage intensified. Francis suffered prolonged periods of delirium during which he spoke incoherently, confusing past and present, addressing figures who were not there. At times he believed himself still a child that others who seemed aware of his condition, whispering that his head was splitting apart. He begged for silence, for darkness, for relief from the pressure that never ceased. His physical deterioration was unmistakable. He could no longer sit upright without assistance. His neck remained rigid, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if the weight of his skull had become too much to bear. Swallowing through dangerous liquids caused choking fits. He was fed thin broths by spoon, much of which spilled from his mouth as his muscles failed to coordinate. Saliva pooled constantly wiped away by servants who now moved around him. With the quiet efficiency reserved for the dying, the swelling behind the ear worsened visibly. The skin appeared stretched and discolored, tense with trapped infection. At moments it seemed as though the skull itself were trying to rupture outward. Physicians could no longer deny the presence of an abscess pressing against the brain. Still, no incision was made. Fear of immediate death outweighed fear of inevitable death. The result was paralysis masquerading as caution. Mary, Queen of Scots, remained close, watching the final erosion of the boy she had married. The relationship never truly begun, now ended in silence and pity. The court, desperate to maintain the illusion of continuity, continued to issue decrees in the king's name. Audiences were suspended entirely. Foreign envoys were told the king was resting. In truth, France was being governed without him. Power flowed around a body no longer capable of bearing it, while the Valois crown sat heavy on the head, already collapsing from within. As December approached, Francis's condition became unmistakably terminal. He drifted into long periods of unresponsiveness. His eyes remained open at times, glassy and unfocused, as though consciousness had withdrawn, but the body had not yet followed. On several occasions it was believed he had died. Each time, the faint breath or twitch of movement delayed the inevitable announcement. Physicians could offer no comfort beyond opiates administered sparingly for fear of suppressing his already fragile respiration. Pain relief remained limited. Suffering continued by the first days of December 1560. Francis II was barely alive. His body was gaunt, his face hollowed, his skin stretched. Thin, over bone, he no longer spoke. His breathing became irregular, marked by long pauses that left those watching frozen in dread. The infection had completed its work. What remained was only the final withdrawal of life. The court waited. So did history. On December 5, 1516, Francis, II of France, died at all alone. He was 16 years old. His death was quiet, almost anticlimactic. After weeks of agony, the final shallow breath, a long pause, and then nothing. The physicians confirmed what everyone already knew. The youngest king of France was gone, undone, not by war or rebellion, but by infection, left to rot inside his skull. The official cause of death was recorded cautiously, couched in the vague language of the era. Inflammation, fever. Privately, the physicians understood the reality. The infection had progressed unchecked into mastoid, itis then into intracranial abscess. The brain had been compressed, poisoned and inflamed until vital centers failed. It was a textbook biological collapse that no textbook yet existed to name it. No full autopsy was conducted. The body of a king was not easily opened, and the Valois court had no desire to expose the intimate mechanisms of royal decay. Yet contemporary accounts describe unmistakable signs: severe swelling of the head, discoloration behind the ear, a foul odor that persisted even after death. These details, preserved in letters and reports, point unmistakably toward intracranial infection. Francis's death, and did more than a life. It destabilized a dynasty already weakened by factionalism and religious tension. His younger brother, Charles IX, ascended the throne as a minor, plunging France into a regency marked by bloodshed and civil war. Mary, Queen of Scots, was abruptly widowed and politically stranded, soon forced to leave France and return to Scotland, where her own tragic downfall awaited. The Valois line survived, Francis II, but it never recovered its footing. His death exposed the fragility of a monarchy dependent on adolescent bodies and inherited vulnerability. Within decades, the dynasty would collapse, entirely replaced by the Bourbons. Francis, his short, painful reign became an unspoken warning, a reminder that crowns offer no immunity from biology. Modern medicine leaves little doubt about what happened. An untreated ear infection, trivial by contemporary standards, became fatal through neglect, fear, and ignorance. Antibiotics would have saved him. In the 16th century, neither existed. Instead, bloodletting and prayer accelerated decline while infection advanced unchecked. Francis II was not incompetent, weak-willed, or cursed. He was a teenage boy whose body failed under circumstances no one around him could truly comprehend. His suffering was prolonged by the very system meant to protect him. A court paralyzed by protocol, reverence, and fear of intervention. Today, his portraits show a pale, delicate youth with uncertain eyes. They conceal the reality. Months of relentless pain confuse him and physical collapse. Beneath the silken ceremony was a body overwhelmed by infection, a nervous system under siege, and the mind slowly drowned in pressure and fever. The story of Francis II to France is not one of dramatic execution or battlefield heroics. It is quieter and more disturbing. It is the story of how power can be undone by neglect, how dynasties can hinge on the health of a single skull, and how biology remains indifferent to crowns. His reign ended where it began, not in triumph, but in fragility and in that fragile body. The Valois monarchy revealed its most human truth, that no amount of ceremony can stop flesh from failing when left to rot from within.